In today's video, we're going to teach you all the basics that you need to know, everything that you need to take amazing videos. First, let's talk about the essential gears that you would need. The first important item is a camera. You can use a mirrorless or a DSLR camera as well as something like your phone. However, notice that this particular kind of camera, a mirrorless for example, will give you more control on the type of aesthetic and also the type of focal length that you want to use, as well as the different settings that you can achieve in there. Next, you're going to need a lens. A lens is basically a piece of glass that will concentrate the light to go to your camera. And depending on the lens that you choose, it will completely change the look of your video. Whether it is because of the specific characteristic of the lens, but also for its focal length. The focal length is basically measured in millimeters, and the smaller the focal length, the wider the angle you will have. For example, for landscape or this kind of establishing shot where you want to show a lot of the scene, something like a 24mm will give you something wide. A 35mm is something more kind of middle range that will allow you to show some of the scene while being able to focus on a particular element. When you go towards 50 or 85mm, however, you will be able to isolate more and more of your subjects. And this kind of focal length are more ideal for portraits as well as focusing on details. An important characteristic, for example, of a lens would be its maximum aperture, which is basically the opening and the amount of light that it can let enter in your camera. Now, the aperture is measured in f numbers, and basically the smaller the f number, the bigger the aperture. So an f4 will let less light enter your camera than an f2 or an f1.4. And something important to notice as well is that if you use your lens at f1.4, then you will have a very shallow depth of field, meaning that your subject or whatever you're focusing on will be in focus while everything else will be basically not in focus. And a lot of people love this kind of characteristics because they are more characteristic to the professional look compared to, let's say, an iPhone camera. I would advise you to get a variable ND filter. Now, a variable ND filter is basically a piece of glass that will act as sunglasses for your lens. It will basically prevent some of the light to reach your camera sensor. Now, I am not gonna go into too much detail here about why you would need such particular piece of gear. We will come back later and talk more about the ND. And finally, if you want some sound in your video, then I would suggest you to get an external microphone. Of course, you can record everything with the internal microphone of your camera. However, typically those microphones are not that good, and having an external microphone will give you that extra quality. Because remember, more than 50% of the experience of the video is the audio. Now let's talk about settings and how to set everything in your camera to be able to achieve the results that you need. First of all, let's talk about the aperture. As I told you, the aperture is basically in f number and controls the amount of light that you let in. If you want to have a very shallow depth of field, you will go with a high aperture, meaning a low f number. However, if you want everything to be sharp in focus, let's say you're shooting landscape or something similar, then you might want to go with a very low aperture, meaning a high f number. This is completely up to you, so choose whatever you need to be able to achieve the result that you want. Next, let's talk about the frame rate of your video. Typically, normal videos would have a 24, 25 or a rate of 30 frames per second. So for this particular example, let's say that we want to have 24 frames per second in our video. Now here is an important rule that you should remember. Your shutter speed of your camera should be double your frame rate. Meaning that right now we want to set our frame rate at 24, we should set our shutter speed to 48. And this is called the 180 rule. Just a note, but remember it, it might be useful to you in the future. Now let's move on to the ISO. Basically the ISO is the gain that allows you to adjust the luminosity of your footage. For this particular example, let's leave it to its minimum value on your camera. Now let's talk resolution. Resolution is basically the quality of the video that you have. You can have 4K, 180p, 720p, etc. In my case, I shoot in 4K with this camera, but with your camera, you can either shoot 4K or 180p or anything that you feel comfortable with. In some cameras, you even have 8K, but that's overkilling it for this example. So choose the resolution that you want to output, 4K, 180p, 720p, as you want. And if you're following along so far and you're looking at the back of your camera, you may observe that you have too much light coming in right now. And everything looks extremely white and you don't know why. Well, that's why you need a variable ND filter. As I told you earlier, an ND is gonna cut a certain amount of light coming into your camera. And this basically allows you to play with those parameters that I said before, shutter speed, aperture, as well as frame rate, without having too much light coming to your sensor. So what you want to do now is to put your variable ND filter at the front of your lens. And if you rotate it towards its maximum value, at one point you will have your exposure right. Okay, so now that your exposure is looking good, before you press record, make sure that your audio is good, that your microphone is connected to your camera. Okay, so now that you have ND, lens, camera, and microphone all connected together, you should be able to start to experiment. Of course, there are tons and tons of elements that comes to make a great video. We can talk about light, we can talk about composition, we can talk about storytelling. There's so much more we can talk about. And we will come with more and more tutorials to help you get started and help you get better over time. So make sure you subscribe for future content. Thank you for watching Pro News. And if you've missed it, check out this video right here, where we talk about everything that you need to know about photography in less than 5 minutes.